Thank you all. Good morning. I'd like to call to order this session of the Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee. We have 3 items on our agenda this morning, and our first item is to discuss potential updates to the OPEB funding policy, which is the framework that the OPEB trust assets use for their portion of the retiree health insurance cost. The current OPEB policy was developed jointly by the Council and the Executive by resolution in 2019, and 2008. And in 2019, sorry, going back a little bit, in 2019, the GO Committee asked that the Executive Branch and Council staff begin exploring options to update the funding policy to establish funded ratio goals and milestones. The work to update the county's OPEB policy was delayed due to the pandemic, and Council and Executive Branch staff have been meeting since late summer to review and develop policy options in collaboration with the county's actuarial consultant, Bolton Partners, and I'm glad to see Mr. Vincenti here today, and it's good to see you again. Today, unless my colleagues have any opening comments, I'm going to turn it over to Council staff to kind of walk us through it, and then we'll turn it over to Mr. Vincenti at Bolton.
Thank you very much, and happy to be here with our colleagues from the Office of Management and Budget, Mr. Orlowski, from the Office of Department of Finance, Ms. Hawkins, and then the Office of Human Resources, Ms. Shovlin and Ms. Bass, and as well as the Mr. Vicente from Bolton Partners, who everyone has been wonderful as always. Collaborative working relationship as we talk through some of these issues related to OPEB. I'm going to give just a little bit of more background on OPEB and kind of where we've been and where we are and how we got to that point. Then Mr. Trompica is going to walk through some of the work and discussions that the group has had, and then we'll turn it to Mr. Vicente to just provide any other comments on the actuarial work that Bolton has done for the group as we talk through some different options. And then we can move forward after that, after any comments and questions from council members, into a discussion of different funding policy options. So just as some background on OPEB, OPEB does traditionally consist of 2 components, and we'll talk about these as we go through the policy. One is pay-as-you-go funding, and that's essentially the annual cost of the group insurance benefits that is being paid for current retirees, and it consists of 2 components. The first is the retirees' contribution, so the money that they pay towards their current group insurance benefits, and the second is the employer's portion, which in this case is the county's portion. And so when we talk about pay-as-you-go funding for the county, and how that's going to be handled going forward in the future, what we're primarily talking about is the county's portion of the pay-as-you-go funding. And the second factor in OPEB is the pre-funding. And the pre-funding is money that's set aside in advance to pay for the to pay for the cost of the benefits that employees earn while they're active employees, and then would then therefore go into the trust for when they are the retirees. And it's similar to kind of a pension plan, and a lot of this, in 2011, the council established a consolidated retiree benefits trust, also sometimes known as the CRHBT, and this is for county government. We typically just call it the OPEB trust to make it a little bit simpler, but the official name is the CRHBT trust, and this includes funding for county government, MCPS, and Montgomery College. Park and Planning Commission manages its own OPEB trust. So the current OPEB funding policy, as the chair mentioned, was developed jointly in 2008 when most local governments and as well as the county were just beginning to pre-fund OPEB liabilities in accordance with new Government Accounting Standards Board, or GASB, recommendations and policies. So what was done was the decision was made to adopt a policy to build up pre-funding, because starting from zero to get to where the pre-funding needed to be on an annual basis was a significant financial commitment. And so the county adopted a policy to slowly build up that pre-funding. There was a pause during the Great Recession when the council and the executive jointly agreed that, because of the lack of funding coming in, there were other priorities that had to be met, and then the pre-funding was restarted after the recession, after we came out of the Great Recession. So the county got to full pre-funding, meaning we are contributing as much as we were supposed to contribute under the actuarial determination in FY15, and then has continued to fund at the actuarially determined contribution amount, or ADC, since then. And the ADC is essentially the sum of the pre-funding and the pay-as-you-go amounts. So in 2019, based on the OLO report 2019-11, and one thing I'll point out is that has a lot of information on historical information on OPEB and what's happened in past years and the funding and things like that. So that's a great resource if anyone wants to go back and spend your night bedtime reading, learning more about what happened in OPEB over the prior years. So as part of the work on that report, the GEO committee did ask us to begin working on updating funding policy options and targets and look at some differences that could be made, with the understanding that the old policy had become kind of outdated because it was a policy to start accumulating assets. So since then, Montgomery County's commitment to OPEB funding has resulted in substantial assets being accumulated in the trust. Between 2008 and 2019, the trust accrued assets of just over $1 billion for the county government, MCPS, and Montgomery College combined. So it's almost not necessarily the same as other governments, but in many respects better than other governments. The county and the council and executive's commitment to OPEB pre-funding has led to substantial assets in the trust. So then during FY21, based on strong financial markets and the investment management by the Board of Trustees, the OPEB Trust achieved a 26% investment return, which added $162.5 million to the trust. This level of investment return was greater than the total investment income for the prior 4 years combined, which was about $150 million. So it's great news, and it's always good when we have strong investment returns leading to significant contributions to the trust. As a result, the trust funded ratio was increased significantly, and for the first time we had a negative EDC. Now, conversely, when you look at investment returns, I do want to point out in FY22, the investment return was a negative 8%, which resulted in investment losses of $79.8 million. So later when we talk about investment returns and volatility, that's kind of an example right there where you can have 1 year of really strong returns and then the next year might look a little bit different. So in the FY23 budget, as a result of the first-time occurrence of the ADC being lower than the pay-as-you-go amount, the county executive did recommend a policy change to the OPEB funding as part of his budget to withdraw $20 million from the OPEB trust to pay a portion of the current retiree pay-as-you-go costs. And again, this is the county's portion of the pay-as-you-go costs. The council didn't agree with the executive's proposal in FY23, and instead asked that the council staff and executive branch staff begin working on a policy to review and update the funding policy to allow for the time frame and procedures and policies for when it was okay to withdraw from the trust, how that would be done, and things of that nature. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Trumka.
Right, so we're on page 4 of the staff memo, and just briefly go over why do we want to have a policy? What are the goals? What are we trying to achieve? So the bullets in the center of page 4 describe some of them. We want to make sure that the trust assets are utilized for their intended purpose and to ensure the long-term viability of the trust. We want to have consistency and reliability in the annual budgeting process. We want to control costs over the long term rather than deferring payments to future years. Of course, we want to protect the county's bond ratings. And ultimately, possibly the most important goal is to enable the trust to pay the county's portions of the pay-go costs that Craig described. If we were at that point in this current year, that would be almost $50 million that would not be an obligation on the operating budget. And that's an opportunity that once you get to the goal could recur year after year. But we also have to recognize in setting the policy that there are variables outside of our control, most notably things like healthcare cost trends and demographic trends. And so we're going to set a policy with some expectations, but we got to expect that our expectations will not come exactly as we planned. So as Craig mentioned, the executive and council staff joined a staff working group, and we've been meeting since last summer to develop a new policy. And we identified 6 key variables that need to be part of this updated policy. You'll see the bullets on the bottom of page 4. One is the amortization method. More about that in a minute. Next is the funded ratio target. And when we say funded ratio or funded level, that means the fund assets measured as a percentage of liabilities, the number of years to achieve that goal, the assumed rate of investment returns, how and when withdrawals would occur from the trust, and then what do you do, are there any variations to the policy in years of extreme fiscal distress? Mr. Howard discussed what happened during the recession. What would happen if something like that happened again? So we're going to talk briefly about several of these elements, moving to the middle of page 5. So the working group asked Bolton to model OPEB funding using a closed amortization method. The county, you calculate OPEB pre-funding right now using a 30-year open amortization. And what open amortization means is that the period for achieving the targeted level, funding level, is restarted each year. So for example, if this year were year 1 out of 30 years and we calculate what we need to pay in year 1, next year we would recalculate what we'd have to do in year 1 again. And so what that does is it perpetually defers attainment of the funding goal. Closed amortization, as the name says, does not annually restart the funding period. And I'll note that the Government Finance Officers Association, GFOA, recommends closed amortization as a best practice for OPEB funding. Next, in terms of the funded ratio target, the target funded level, the working group requested Bolton run scenarios assuming 75%, 85%, and 100%. Those percentages are asset levels as a percent of the ratio of liabilities. And you'll note that the current practice is to fund at 100%, but again, that's under the open amortization. So on paper, we have 100%, but because you'll never get there, it's constantly deferred. Our current funded target level is effectively less than 100%. Bolton, in some of their writings online, does suggest that OPEB plan sponsors, like the county government, could consider a lower than 100% funding target because OPEB benefit costs are much less certain. There's much more variability in them than, for example, a traditional pension plan. And I'm quoting from the italics in the middle of page 5. They write that governments with traditional OPEB plans should consider a contribution target of less than 100% of the accrued liability to reduce the possibility of overfunding. And they state that funding at 80 or 90% still promotes benefit security while reducing the risk of overfunding the OPEB benefits. Moving on to the time period to achieve the goal, the working group asked Bolton to produce funding schedules based on 3 time frames, achieving the goal within 5 years, within 15 years, and within 25 years. So the trade-off here is obviously a shorter time period achieves your goal quicker and it frees up those resources quicker, but it comes at a budget cost. If you have to pour in a lot of dollars early, that reduces your flexibility and increases the budget impact. Again, looking at GFOA best practices, they recommend that the period never exceed 25 years, but they ideally recommend a 15 to 20 year time frame. Top of page 6 about the rate of investment returns that Mr. Howard mentioned earlier. So the group asked Bolton to model 2 rates of return, one, the current policy of 7.5%, but also a second one at 6.5%. That was in recognition of the potential of an economic downturn. So with all of these variations that you saw on the previous page, there are actually 18 different scenarios that Bolton modeled for us, and we thank you for that. The details of that are available in the attachments, and Mr. Vicente is here to answer them. But in summary, 15 of the 18 alternatives did add additional dollars in year 1, would increase our year 1 costs. And that's for a variety of reasons. The closed amortization period, the shorter time period, they're all under 30 years, and also for those that have the lower assumed investment rate, that would also affect the costs in the early years. Bolton also did for us what's known as a stress test, and what a stress test is, it shows how things would play out in the expected funding schedule if investment returns varied from what we expected, if we didn't get that 7.5% or 6.5% year after year. In the scenario they ran it for 6.5% and a 15-year plan to get to 85% funded. And in the stress test, what they do is they apply the highest and lowest 10-year pattern of investments historically over the past 2 decades, and then apply it to what we had planned out under each of the scenarios. And Bolton informed us that we have, with this fixed target, with trying to do something, let's say, in 15 years, there is significant volatility as the target date grows near. And so they recommended what they called a modified time period, a modified 15 years in this example, where instead of holding firm to the target date, it allows for the funding to extend beyond the time period, particularly if returns fall short of expectations, and particularly in those last years, so as not to force a very rapid catch-up in a short amount of time. So the table on the top of page 7 shows the results of the stress test. You'll note the darker blue line, the straight line in the center, that shows the funded ratio if investment returns corresponded with our assumptions. We got 6% year after year, 6.5% year after year. If that magical outcome would have occurred, then we would get to 85% within the time frame and then level off there. The gray and light blue lines show the results if investment returns were to mimic our best 10 years. In that case, the funded ratio would be up to 92%. And the red and yellow lines show what would happen if investment returns mimic our worst years. And there the funded ratio climbs to 75%, but doesn't quite achieve our goal. The takeaway from all of this is, while we need to have a goal, we also have to accept the uncertainty in these. Any one of these scenarios could happen. We're planning for something, but we need to know that variations will occur. Finally, on this section, trust withdrawal scenarios. Bolton also modeled all of these scenarios assuming, or some of these scenarios, assuming different fixed withdrawal contributions, withdrawing no dollars from the trust each year, $10 million annually, and $20 million annually. And what they noted was this withdrawal policy would create less budget volatility. You're taking out you're taking out money to give to other items in the budget, so there's less budget volatility, but it's at the expense of funded ratio volatility. So in other words, it has an annual budget impact withdrawing these dollars, which steady things, but it could significantly delay the achieving of the funding goal. The table on the top of page 8 shows the effect of a $20 million annual withdrawal. The table shows that the projected funding ratio over a 10-year period. So at the assumed investment returns, the blue line, funded ratio only grows to about 54% after a decade of contributions. That shows the effect of the withdrawals. The gray line shows the best case investment returns, raising the funding ratio to about 80%. And the red line shows what would have happened with the lowest investment returns, with funding dropping below 40% after a decade. So you can see the effect of the annual withdrawals and how they can significantly delay attainment of the funding goals. So, Chair Stewart, at this point it may be appropriate to interrupt our presentation and turn it over to Mr. Vicente from Bolton to summarize his conclusions. Is
That'd
this
be
the right
great.
time? Great.
Thank you so much for that.
Okay, thank you. So, the 18 scenarios that were put out there were designed as a way to take the 7 bullets that we looked at earlier that were the goals. And because you put these goals out there and you say, well, these goals sound great, but what do they mean in real life? And so that's what the 18 scenarios were designed to do, to put some numbers around what those goals could materialize as. They weren't necessarily, here are 18 equally worthwhile proposals. They were designed to give a sense for what happens if you shorten or extend the target funding period. What happens if you have an investment policy that results in a lower long-term return versus a higher long-term return? What happens with volatility in investments when you have a more conservative or more aggressive position? So that was the intention of the 18 different versions. And so it's great that I think they did the right thing. I think they helped the working group really get a good handle on what all these different scenarios combine to and what it would look like if you were more or less conservative, more aggressive in funding, less aggressive in funding, to understand what goes on there. The bottom line is if you adopt a funding policy, a budget policy that's more conservatively positioned, then when you have good years, they'll be that much better, and when you have bad years, they'll be that much less bad. Because there always will be good and bad years, as we showed by looking at the different scenarios we had together. I think the next, we looked at all these different methodologies. I think they give us a good foundation to then make decisions. The one thing we haven't done yet is to look at part of the policy that would say, how do you put those guardrails around things so that when things go right or things go wrong, how do you adopt or adapt the policy to account for those different contingencies. That'd be really the next phase of things. But they did a great job of summarizing these. I would love to spend an hour or two just talking through the numbers, but in the issue of time, let me pause there, and I don't know if there's questions, if you had a chance to look at the different presentations, if there's anything you want to ask about specifically.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And Mr. Howard, I didn't know if that concluded what you wanted to present.
Well, if there's questions that it's appropriate for Bolton to, if you want to ask Bolton now, you can go and do that, or we could go ahead and walk through staff's proposal for an updated funding policy and then allow the executive branch to make their comments on that, and then ask all the questions that you would like to after that as well. Up to you.
Do my colleagues have any questions for Bolton? No, why don't we continue? Thank you.
Okay, great. So thank you to all the work that Bolton did. And so starting on page 8, I'll go through and summarize council staff's proposal for an updated OPEB funding policy based on the work that's been done to date by Bolton. I want to note that the request from the council last year was that we work to develop a policy with the idea that we would have something to discuss in advance of the FY24 budget, and so we were not in the same place we were last year in terms of not having any information when we had to make budget decisions, and so that's the purpose of having this discussion now before we get into to budget decisions and deliberations. So after reviewing the data and the Bolton's analysis, council staff's proposal is to adopt an updated funding policy to achieve an 85% funded ratio in 15 years via a closed amortization schedule while assuming a 6.5 investment rate of return. And it is our position that this combination optimally ensures both the long-term viability of the OPEB trust and controls costs over the long term without overburdening the annual operating budget. So based on the analysis, we wanted to kind of go through what does this mean if we were to adopt a policy like this. So there's a couple things. First, the county would need to increase pre-funding contributions by about $20 million in year 1, with this amount reducing each year to about $1 million in year 8. And on the graph on page 9, this is indicated by the red dots. So that's everything in red is additional pre-funding contributions. So that would be an increased budget cost starting in year 1 and moving through for several more years. Again, everything can vary a little bit based on investment returns, and this is just assuming the baseline scenario, but that's what the implications would be. Then the county could begin withdrawing from the trust, starting with about $500,000 to help pay for current year pay-as-you-go costs in year 9, with that amount increasing to about $6.7 million in year 15. And that amount is shown by the black dots in that same chart. Then in year 16, when the 85% funding target has been presumably reached, the trust would pay the entire county portion of the annual pay-as-you-go costs, estimated to be about $65 million by then, and the trust would continue to pay those costs each year going forward. This is what Mr. Tromka mentioned as, at that point, those dollars would be potentially freed up for other uses in the operating budget. Now, it's important to point out that, similar to a pension plan, depending on variables such as investment returns, healthcare costs, and things like that, there will still likely need to be annual contributions to the trust needed to maintain that 85% target funded ratio. So even while the trust is paying the full county portion of annual pay-as-you-go costs, there may be additional dollars that need to be put in that net out some of that funding for the employees that are currently working to maintain that funded ratio. And as we've seen with the retirement costs, pension plan costs over the years, sometimes that amount is very small, especially when investment performance is very strong. When investment performance is less strong, then that amount increases, and that's just an annual part of the budget that the council takes up every year. Then, to address the volatility in investment returns and to maintain a higher degree of budgeting consistency, council staff does support moving forward with suggestions that Bolton has made to utilize the modified funding ratio and potentially amortize gains and losses over 15 years, with the idea that if you have a huge investment loss in year 14, you don't have to have a giant funding spike of $50–60 million that you weren't expecting in year 15, because the 15 is the last year of your target. Some other policy components that staff suggests including would be provision to allow the Executive Council to jointly agree to deviate from the policy guidelines during periods of fiscal distress, like the Great Recession example we gave earlier. For example, the Reserve and Fiscal Policies Resolution includes a specific trigger about when the U.S. enters a recession or there's an occurrence of a national emergency that allows for deviation from that policy. So there could be similar language developed for something like this. And then also that policy includes procedures for how you then build back up to meet our required 10% target. So we could also look at a portion of the policy like that. And then also to continue conducting updated funding evaluations every 2 years with a broader review of the policy to be conducted at least every 5 years. And the idea of this is that you would have continual check-ins that are preset to say, is the funded ratio target still right? Is it still what we want to try to achieve? Are the years still right? Is the investment return still right? So if investment returns are higher than projected, you may think that we may need to up that assumption. If the investment returns are lower than projected, we may think that the assumption needs to be decreased. And so the idea would be you continually have a process to review and update and decide whether you're still on the right track or need to make any changes. And specifically, when you enter the period, the crossover period of when you're starting to withdraw from the trust, that's another great opportunity to say, is the amount that we're planning to withdraw based on the actuarial calculations that's still the right amount, or do we want to look at different factors and think about that and kind of compare that with where the budget is at the same time. So that's the summary of the council staff proposal to begin discussions, and then could ask the executive branch staff for comments and their perspective as well.
Good morning. Corey Orlowski with the Office of Management and Budget. The overarching statement here is that the executive branch feels that it's premature to develop a full policy at this point. At risk of sounding antagonistic on this, the executive branch and council staff have worked really well on this effort so far. There are simply too many unanswered questions. As the group that's not tasked with developing the policy, but answering and helping provide information to those who are, there are simply too many questions out there still where the answer is, I don't know, I can't tell you. We haven't done the research on that. And those are all very good, very relevant questions that need to be asked when developing a policy such as this. And as the one providing the recommendations and feedback, it's an uncomfortable position to be in to just have too many unanswered questions. We've done great work on some of the scenarios that set up an idea of where the boundaries are on if we did something, what could it look like? But to the point of the volatility, we really haven't done a whole lot of modeling on what the volatility and our projected solutions to dealing with that volatility would look like. I think we're close. I think we've got a bit of work left to do, but we're on the right track and we know where we need to head. I think what would be helpful to us as a group would be to get some framework from you guys. Figure out, is this the right direction? Do you have specific things you want us to look at? Again, this is an OPEB trust that was designed with one purpose in mind, and that purpose was to pay a portion or all of retiree health expenses. That was in 2008. We pre-funded since then, which means that there are retirees now who were active employees then, who we've pre-funded their retiree costs, but instead of paying it with the one source that we have for that, we're still paying for it with general fund dollars. We're trying to get to a point where we can start using the trust for what it's designed to do, the only thing it's designed to do. And the policies that we've been looking at seem to still push that date further into the future, while having an asset pool of $800+ million that grows or decreases based on what happens in the market, but it's still a really large pot of money, and we have to respond to the taxpayers who are paying taxes for us to put money away to not use it the way it was designed. And what we're trying to accomplish here is to figure out what is the right way to approach both the long-term sustainability while recognizing that we've passed the point of asset growth in the trust. It is now a real thing, living and growing and increasing and decreasing by tens or hundreds of millions of dollars based on what happens out there. We're really interested in looking at what the volatility guardrails can do and looking at where we want to go so that we can give, from a budgeting purpose, from a OPEB trust contribution purpose, all those little things, where is a happy medium? Where can we go that maintains the fund while still allows it to be something that serves its only purpose? The policy that's presented as the option by council staff has one troubling factor in that it suggests a policy determination of the investment rate of return. We deal with that through a significantly rigorous process to determine, based on experience and projected market values, what's the right level. And one of our main concerns is that we're establishing by policy something that we have a tremendous process to go through that goes through auditor scrutiny, and it's improper to address, to prescribe an investment rate of return in a policy rather than let the actual experience dictate what happens. Now, part of the volatility is what happens when deviations occur. What happens if through that rigorous process it goes from 7.5 to 7.25 or 6.25 or whatever it may be. We then know what we can do in those scenarios. But to say up front, let's switch it to 6.5, effectively what we're doing is saying we're committing to putting more money away in this trust that does not yet have a utilization purpose. And is that the right thing to do? We would not recommend it this time. I don't know if my colleagues have anything else to add on this.
Yeah, I would just add to that. And in the packet from Bolton, one of their letters, one of their communications, it referred to the additional analysis that could be performed. So as Tom was mentioning, it was a staged and phased analysis that we were performing. And we're midway through that. The example of using a 6.5%, as we discussed that was what our assumption was of what could be the worst case, bottom number in terms of any potential change in going forward to the long-term investment rate. But it is a long-term investment rate. And there are built-in processes to arrive at that. There are also, the concept that if you select an assumption for your funding policy that is different than the assumptions that you use for accounting and financial reporting, there should be a rational basis for that. And so, for example, asset smoothing was mentioned in Bolton's records, and the idea of doing something different than accounting and reporting requires. That requires that you use the market rate of investments each year to determine your expense. That accounting rule can lead to extreme volatility on the budgeting and funding side. And so the idea of building in some approach to asset smoothing for funding makes sense. The same concept applies to the investment rate of return, the long-term investment rate of return. To select a percentage for a funding policy and a budgeting policy that would be different than the rate that has been vetted and is being used for the long-term investment rate of return for financial accounting and reporting that's disclosed in our audit report and therefore goes through in our annual audited statements and therefore goes through the auditor scrutiny, there should be a rational basis for that. And that rate is long-term. It's not, looking at what could happen in the next 2 to 3 years. So those are just some comments to expand on the comments that Corey made.
Thank you. Anyone else? No? Any other comments from Mr. Vicente, Mr. Howard, Mr. Trumka?
The only comment I would make with regard to the investment rate of returns, and the executive branch staff makes some great points, and there's lots of different considerations and options to think about when you're determining what's an appropriate investment rate of return. But the comment Mr. Vicente made earlier about the benefit of a more conservative assumption as part of a funding policy, I think is very important to point out that if you have a more conservative assumption, when times are better, it's better because you're reaping the benefit of that, and when times are worse, it's less worse than if you have more of aggressive target.
If I could just follow up on that, one of the things that we didn't do, and we would need to get the county's investment experts involved, is to give us an analysis to say, for example, based on the expected asset allocation for this trust and expected cash flows in the future, how would they characterize a 6.5% or 7 or 7.5% long-term investment return? Is that 90th percentile returns where they expect over 20 years to be in excess of that 90% of the time, or is it 50%? And so I think that's one of the pieces that we think we should explore, get that information, which is relatively standard, That asset allocation policy has to be verified. And during this last, since 2008, the trust hasn't had to worry about cash disbursements, so they could be more aggressive in an investment positioning. Looking into a period where you're going to possibly pull money out, then you need to have cash available, and so you have to possibly consider more and less liquid investments. And so I think that's the part that we think needs a little more exploration, is to say, given those possible changes to the asset allocation, what would the investment consultants say is the likelihood of a 6.5 versus 7 versus 7.5% type return, and what's the policy going to be? Do we want to position ourselves so that we're right at the 50th percentile, which means that we're expected to do better half the time and worse half the time? Or are we more 65%, where we expect to do better 65% of the time? That type of positioning, I think, is what we want to be very deliberate about and specific about what we're doing.
Great. Thank you. Would you like to? Yes.
Yes, if I could just add something as a member of the boards that oversee the investments in these funds. What has happened over the years is that the investments in the healthcare trust fund are invested in more liquid funds because of the uncertainty about the whether there'll be funds put in, withdrawn. So the return is lower than it is for our pension funds. So setting a policy will provide predictability, which could increase the returns on the fund, which is critical. 2 years ago, or I think it was early 2022, when the fund advisors estimated what the 10-year return would be, it was 5.6%. This past year, it raised up to 7.2%, in part due to inflation and returns associated with that. And I think, from a board member's perspective, these are some of the issues that we're thinking about, and our advisors are constantly doing new estimates of what the 10-year return will be. And of course, that could help advise this policy. I think it is so important that this is not a rigid return number that we won't change. We'll be constantly looking at it. The staff has suggested a 2-year analysis. If something changes dramatically, we could certainly do it earlier than that as well. So,
Great. Thank you very much for that. And actually, I'd like to go back to Mr. Vincente, because one of the questions I actually had for you, and you started to respond to it, is you've run these 18 scenarios, you've done the stress testing on one of them more in depth. In addition to what you just talked about the investment policy and looking forward to the returns on that, are there other things that in your experience, need to be done at this point?
So I think the biggest thing is the stress testing, probably something more on what we would call a stochastic evaluation, where we take the capital market assumptions, the different variances and covariance of the investments, and do that type of a testing to get a good statistical look at what's the range, the likely range of returns. One of the things with the retiree medical program is that we're talking about the investment side. There's also the medical plan side, where there can be a lot of volatility, which is where the lower than 100% target idea comes from. But of course, there's also the idea that within certain parameters, the county has the ability to adjust things such as co-pays and deductibles, which could help control some of that, depending on what happens with inflation and medical costs overall. But really, it's that type of modeling to get that additional detail from the investment side, to put that into the models, to get that better idea. And that would help to inform us what Karen mentioned about doing some of the asset smoothing for purposes of creating the annual budget for contributions and ADC, as well as any other sort of reserving type methods that might be deemed appropriate to help stabilize any county outlays on a forward-looking basis. And there's, in some of our documents, we had 4 or 5 different things we talked about that could be included depending on how narrow or how constrained we need to make future contribution commitments in the future. So, for example, if you're going to be really, say, we have to really make sure this stays in a narrow range, then that talks to potentially either one outcome is potentially a more conservative investment policy to try to reduce the amount of volatility from that side. Others are things such as setting up what they call stability funds, where you would essentially put money in but not really count it, so to speak, but draw from it when those times of volatility occur. So you feed it when things are good, you draw from when things are bad in order to stabilize the county's outlay. So there's things like that, and based on how wide or narrow we need to make the parameters, we would recommend different factors such as that, or different features such as that. But we haven't really looked into how those would work under the different scenarios at this point. We wanted to get the baseline together and then go into that next phase of saying, okay, now how do we make sure that the volatility in terms of the county's view of it is constrained?
Great. And not to put you on the spot, but we do have a recommendation from council staff. Any thoughts on the recommendation that has been presented today?
So I think as Corey said, I think it's a very good start. I think, in our opinion, and what we see with a lot of our clients, trying to get the plan funded to your target in 15 years is a great timeline. Some will go to 20 years, some will go to 15, but you're already in and around 50% funded. So from here going to 15 years seems like a reasonable approach, and then having the ongoing, as there's deviations, as there will be every year, funding those deviations over their own 15-year period gives you that ability to avoid any huge spikes because of 1 year's up or down. So I think that's great. I think that the what was the other features of the amortization? I think so that's good. I think the other target items are in good shape. I think the closed. I think the 85% is good. I think the 15 years is good. I think the biggest piece for us is to get a little more technical on setting that long-term rate of return, so we know exactly where we position the funding, whether we're conservative, aggressive, whatever it is on the investment side. And then to establish those guardrails, to establish, do we need to do asset smoothing, which is a very common actuarial approach, but commonly it's 5 years, where you would average in returns over 5 years. That's common. Is it the right thing for this fund? Let's take a look at it and see, based on what the investment, and again, it's all collaborative, what the investment side is looking at. Is 5 years the right period, and how much does that help with us? Or do we need one of these reserve fund, side fund type things? How does that look? How much does that affect the budget? And how aggressive should we be in building that? It's one of those things, it's easier to build it when things are going really well, because then you can kind of put money in there. It's hard to build it when things aren't going well. But looking at those features, I think those are the next steps. So I think we're close. I think we have a lot of good foundation laid. I think it's just putting those extra pieces on so that we have a well-rounded policy.
Great. And again, not to put you on the spot, but our job as the committee is to, give a recommendation as, moving forward. And for those pieces that you talked about, and we say we're close, are we talking a few months to do more analyses, to look at these things? What is your estimation of how close we are?
So I would say if we walk out of here with a really good idea of, okay, what are those things? What do we need to try to stay within? I think probably, I guess I'd look at other people's staffing needs. From our perspective, if we have a good roadmap, really, within a couple of months we would be able to be back and have here's what our recommendations or ideas are, and here's how well they work or don't work under different scenarios.
Okay, great. Councilmember Friesen? Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. First of all, I really appreciate this conversation. I've been asking for this conversation for 4 years, and so I really appreciate it. I appreciate how far we've come. I think 4 years ago, it was an $89.6 million diversion after unfortunate news from the state for what was the lump sum payment. We were running into an annual issue where we were waiting towards the end of the year to see what fiscal realities we faced, and then ultimately OPEB oftentimes was being used to address broader fiscal issues. And I appreciate the fact that we're out of that. That was on the heels of what I believe was over $300 million over 5 years of diversions from the trust fund. Moving forward, last year we had a pretty significant change as well with what I thought was a very abrupt request and proposal to take $20 million out of the fund, which was not contemplated and hadn't been considered. I had serious reservations and concerns about that. I raised those. I'm glad that the council rejected that proposal and that we had the financial flexibility, fortunately, in the end, to do it in a way that was prudent. But we need a policy. And this was the issue that we had last year, and I'm a little bit concerned about the posture that we didn't need a policy to take $20 million out of the fund, but we need a policy to plan for the future of how we're going to move forward with the fund. And that just doesn't comport to me on how this is supposed to work. I really appreciate the work of Bolton and all the work of the working group. I wish that we were 2 months ago, with 2 months to go, to be honest with you. I think it's unfortunate. I wish we hadn't 18 months ago taken so much time to figure out how we could take money out of the trust, and we're talking about how we could get the trust to the place where we wanted it to be. And with respect, I would disagree that the point of the trust is how it was stated. A trust fund, the idea is so that the trust fund is built to pay for the expenses, some portion of it. Not that the point of the trust is to take money out of the trust. It's that the returns generated by the trust are built up to the point where they can be handled. And so I think, for me, I think we need to move forward with the policy. I would have preferred we move forward with policy 4 years ago. I'm glad that we're getting close and I think ready now to do it. To me, there's only 2 issues that need to be resolved, it sounds like, and they seem like they can be resolved quite quickly. I think we can start as the budget is sent to us in a recommendation with a more conservative approach, which I would be prepared to send guidance on right now, and if over the next 2 months we determine that it's more conservative than it needs to be, great. That will give us some additional flexibility before the end of May. To me, the asset smoothing, should it be 5 years as is the standard, or is 4 years more appropriate, or 7 years, or some number in between? That is a decision that can be decided moving forward, but I'd be fine personally with 5 years. With the 6.5%. I mean, the rational basis, as I heard earlier, is to me quite obvious. As was stated by Bolton, the rational basis of having a difference is to be more conservative because it's more fiscally prudent. That's the rational basis. If that's not the right number, then we can adjust that number, and I'd personally be okay as long as we have a policy and the policy makes sense and it's fiscally prudent. If 6.75% is a better number, great. If 7% is a greater number, and we can adjust that as we move forward as part of that policy, which is what I think is baked in to the staff proposal. I do think we need to look at the percentile. To me, I'd honestly be comfortable saying we agree to the percentile right now and say, we don't know what the percentile is. You need to do the stress test for that. But, 70%, 80%, I mean, I'd love to hear from Mr. Vincente of what you think a prudent percentile would be. I mean, you don't know what where that number would land, but I think you probably have a general idea of what would be an appropriate percentile to look like. To me, 50% is way too volatile, personally. Like, if we're off as often as we're on, then that is not a good way for us to be moving forward with a trust of this size and a budget of our magnitude. But 100% it can't happen. So what's the appropriate number? So do you have any thoughts on what that number would be?
So I think that. So we'd have to you see a lot of range. So if you look at in the marketplace, for example, 6 to 7.5% is what you see. So a pretty wide range. So a lot of different organizations have come to their own conclusions in a lot of different places. I think what we'd want to do with that, before I can answer that question, is it's not so much as it's the rate itself, but it also ties into, when you look at the investment allocation, what do the tails look like? So you might get something that says, well, this is a a 65th percentile return is 6.75%. We like that. But if that particular asset allocation also has more volatility built into it than another asset allocation, then you might want to, that would guide you to say is 65%, 65th percentile the right versus the 70th or whatever it is. So if you have something that has some very volatile investments in it, then you're going to have these very big tail swings. And so then you might want to position yourself more conservatively versus something that the investments don't have those big tail swings and they're more tracking it in a more uniform way. So that's my non-answer. Sorry.
We heard earlier that your non-answer answer. I appreciate that you made yourselves available last year when this proposal came through, and I had a long and extended conversation, asked a lot of questions, which I appreciate, and I appreciate the non-answer answer, and no problem on that. It was stated earlier that there's a suggestion that it would be improper to set a rate of return in policy. Do you have a position on that?
I don't have a position on that. That's really, the good and bad of it is, the good is if you set it, then everybody knows exactly what it is. The bad of it is that then when market conditions change, you're running back to make changes to your policy, and is that create problems?
Do you think that setting it and then providing every 2 years or a set period of time where it can be reassessed is an appropriate way to address that concern?
I mean, that really goes to your governance approach. How does that work? It's ideally the investment group is making their assessments more than annually. They're probably looking at it quarterly, if not more often, and looking at what are the market signals telling them, what are the capital market assumptions. Our goal or our best practice is that we have a long-term return idea or percentage that we feel that can last for a longer period of time, so it gives you that stability as far as what the outlook would be. There will always be short-term changes, just as we've had these last 2 years, but the long-term outlook should be more relatively stable. You certainly can. In the private sector, they went to that type of approach where they're changing the long-term return on an annual basis when they do their year-end accounting.
We just heard 5.6% and 7.2% from Ms. Michelson. So 6.5% to me seems right in the window, personally. So, I think at the very least, we absolutely cannot come out of this current calculation without closed amortization. Absolutely, that needs to change. I would have severe heartburn if we did not do that. I think, personally, I think we're ready to set a preliminary policy that can be refined during the budget process. The refinement, I think, will be on the margins if we set a policy. So I would be supportive of the council staff recommendations to set that as the policy, to signal to the executive branch that that's what we hope and expect that the executive will send over in his recommended budget, and we'll hope that the working group will work on that, will provide us guidance and give any refinements as appropriate, specifically on the asset smoothing and on the rate of return. And if there are tweaks and changes to how we approach that, I think it makes sense. But coming out of this with the idea that it's premature to set a policy is just not an acceptable answer. We've been at this for far too long. We, at last year's budget, said we want a policy before we get to this time next year. We're at this time next year, and we need a policy. So I think we need to follow through on our commitments. We need to follow through on the expectations that have been set. And I don't think it's going to get easier, to be very clear, to make a policy like this. I think if there's a time where we set a policy, it's going to be now, because every economic indicator suggests that times are only going to get tougher, and so the time was yesterday, in my view, to do this. So with that, I'll yield back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Katz?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you all for everything you're doing on this. This is, I believe we're investigating this in a correct and thorough way. As was pointed out, we certainly have a history, almost unfortunately, we have a history of having these discussions. And I am pleased to hear you say that not all of the 18 proposals were equal. If they were, we'd have really been in trouble. This is truly an investment for the taxpayers and the residents and everyone associated with this for the future. And therefore, we need to make sure our future is clear and what we're trying to do. And I agree we need a policy. I think Councilmember Friedson said it well 2 seconds ago. And I'm someone that believes it's not going to be a shock here that I'm more fiscally conservative approach is the best approach. You're much better off to find out, you know what, I found an extra $10 in my pocket than realize that you don't have money in your pocket. So I believe a fiscally conservative approach is the right way. And I also believe we'd be wise to set a rate of return policy, a rate of return in the policy, so that we can have that everyone knows where we are and where we should try to be with flexibility. And you had said that you don't want to be antagonistic, and you're not. I am very pleased that both sides of the street are working on this, but we need to make certain that we get it right, and we need to make certain that things will be in line. I actually agree with the next steps for what our staff has suggested, and that says if we support going forward with an updated policy, that the staff will work with the executive staff and the county's actuarial consultant to prepare an updated policy resolution to review by the full council. I believe that's the next step. I think we need to do it sooner rather than later. The idea that we could be back here in a couple months, I think is probably not the best thing. I think if you would have said we can be back here next week, that would be, I think we have to be realistic, but that would have been a much better answer for me than to say, we're going to get to you. So that's where I am. I'm for the conservative approach, 5 years at 6.5% or whatever the next step working group will come up with. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Great, thank you. I just want to clarify with my colleagues what is on the table, because I think we have a recommendation from the council staff. What I heard Council Vice President Friedson say is support generally for the council staff recommendation and calling this a preliminarily setting a policy. We also heard from Mr. Vincente that there are certain steps that we want to go forward. We heard concerns from the county exec staff. So what I'm going to summarize, and tell me if I got this correct, where I see us going, and I'm going to go back to, Mr. Trumka. I think you said we need to have a goal but plan for uncertainty. And I very much appreciate the feedback and the need to look at further things, but there comes a time when you have to say, we got to do this, and we have to move forward, and I think that's what you're hearing from the committee today. So I think what I'm hearing from my colleagues is that we agree with the direction that the council staff are going in, and we would like to continue in that direction. And we also believe that, given what Mr. Vincente said, there are a few more analyses that need to be done and some more input, but that we don't want to wait on this. We want this to move forward. Is that clear enough? Do you want to?
Yes, that is clear enough. I'll just add one piece. My goal that I was suggesting is that in this budget, the county executive sends over a proposal that is aligned with the council staff recommendation. And in so doing, we continue the work that the working group is doing, and in the final budget, we refine it as needed, if needed.
Yes.
But I think we need to send the signal clearly to the county executive that it is our expectation that this is the direction that we are going with this policy, that we will finalize with the budget, and that we want the recommended budget to reflect this preliminary policy.
Yes.
Everything else, absolutely.
All right, I'm in agreement. All right, I think the committee's in agreement with that. Mr. Howard, is that clear? What you decided? Okay. Any other comments or thoughts? Yeah.
So I'll just comment that I don't know that at this time we can commit that the policy will be reflected in the budget, which is nearing its completion of development. It will be passed along as such, as the request. One other clarification, we've been talking about developing a policy, creating a policy. In technicality, we have a policy. It's outdated and it needs to be updated. So the policy is what's kind of driving a lot of the impetus of where we are. It was pay-go plus pre-funding is the contribution amount. The policy is to fund the ADC. Last year, the issue that came up was that the ADC happened to be a lower number than the pay-go number. So it dictated by policy that a withdrawal was expected. And it was not anticipated. When the policy was developed, that kind of equation wasn't thought of. So we're behind the eight ball on, oh wow, the policy no longer reflects what happens in reality. And so we were following policy when we recommended utilization last year. It's just that the policy resulted in something that we hadn't contemplated beforehand, and really demonstrates the need for an updated policy that does, in fact, reflect it.
Yeah. Before I turn to my colleague, I would say we have a policy, but it is so narrow, and I think we have identified that it is inadequate. And so, yeah, I agree. Yes, we have a policy that is woefully inadequate. And I know the frustration from my colleagues that it predates me sitting in this chair, and the hope that we can move forward. So I'll turn to Council Vice President Friedson and then Councilmember Katz.
Yeah, well, two things. One, I'm disappointed to hear that there won't be a commitment. I would suggest that we send a letter to the executive to formalize the request as a committee. It's not a formal policy, but I would suggest that we do that. We can discuss that. About the policy, I agree with the chair wholeheartedly, and I would argue that we didn't have a policy related to a withdrawal. That was something that was not contemplated in the policy, and a decision was made, a very intentional decision was made, without consulting the council at all. And it was not done in a spirit of collaboration. It was not done with a coordinated effort, as I would have expected, where we were confronted with a question that we hadn't faced before, where the policy was at best unclear and what I would consider to be silent on, and I would feel very strongly that everybody who was part of that policy would have assumed it would mean nothing. It would mean zero, not negative. Like ultimately a negative number wouldn't mean removing money from the trust, particularly after there had been many examples of when times were tough, of using the assets that were supposed to go into the trust to fund other obligations in the budget, including over expenditures, which largely through overtime and other things that had to be had to be spent. So I just think it's important to note that. Can I ask, is there a commitment at the very least, at the bare minimum, to use closed amortization for the ADC calculation this year?
So we would apply closed amortization to the next valuation, which would happen for the data we get June 30th, end of this year. So we are in the second of a 2-year valuation schedule, starting to do the next 2-year valuation schedule in the fall. And when we apply those parameters, those assumptions, it would be to the next valuation.
So are you not able to use the existing valuation in the ADC calculation to use a closed amortization?
To redo the valuation at this point, I will let Tom bring up any points from them, but in the context of the budget coming over in 13 days, I don't believe so.
Was there any consideration to using closed amortization as the working group has been discussing it as a best practice over months?
We have been discussing that as the part of the variable of the assumption strategy for valuations for several valuation cycles now.
But it's suggested here that it's not a variable, that it's a best practice. The 6.5% is a variable. The smoothing of an asset is a variable. using a closed amortization schedule so that you never get to 100%, that you move the target every time you set the target, is not a variable. So that's doubly disappointing that there isn't a commitment to move forward with a policy and that there, at bare minimum, isn't a willingness to look at what is the financial best practice as determined by our expert third-party consultant to make the ADC contribution. I'm afraid we're running into the same issues we ran into last year, and we're not going to solve the problem that we've been talking about for years and years and years. So again, I will reiterate, I hope that we can send a letter to the county executive setting our expectations, and very much hope that the commitment that can't be made today will be reconsidered, and that the county executive will do what is the most fiscally prudent and responsible way to handle these issues.
So I'd just like to point out, it was brought up earlier that the original policy in 2008 was developed in collaboration between the county executive and the council. And at this point, it does not feel like the county executive's position has been finalized and the policy has been developed unilaterally on the council side.
Councilmember Knapp.
Thank you very much. I agree with sending the letter. I agree that we should have all the listings in there that you have outlined. And the bottom line is, yes, we have a policy. That's the only thing we probably can agree on at this point. But if you have a policy that had things in there that have happened and that you couldn't anticipate, why in the world would we want to keep that policy? And you're in agreement. We need to change the policy. And so you need to change it as quickly as we can. And we need to make certain that it makes sense for what we know, rather than just have a policy to say, well, we have a policy. So I'm in agreement with sending the letter, and I think we need to do that as quickly as we can. Thanks.
Great. Thank you all. Mr. Vicente, thank you so much. I'm very glad that Bolton could be here and present today this excellent work that you've done. I want to thank Mr. Trumka and Mr. Howard, and do a plug for that OLO report for folks who need to get a primer on OPEB before they even start watching this conversation. It is an excellent primer, and I appreciate all the time and work that went into that. Very much thank the county executive staff for coming over today and working on this. I do hope that we can continue to work together as we move forward. And I will say, I understand the county exec's budget is coming over very quickly to us. And I understand the constraints and the work that you all are putting in and the long hours. And I appreciate you coming here today and continuing to work collaboratively. So thank you very much for that. Thank you. And that will conclude item 1 on our agenda. And we have been joined by our colleague, Councilmember Lukey, for the next 2 items that we have. Yeah, right, the next 2. Yeah, I know, and this is like, yeah.
Oh, okay.
You want to,
Well,
or you can stay, whatever. It's, you can stay there.
yeah, I'm signed in.
Great. Well, and also, this is, I believe, your first 2 bills, correct?
Yes.
Indeed it is. They are, I should say. I know.
To be grammatically correct.
Yes. It is. All right, I'm just switching papers here. So the first item we are going to take up, or the second item, but the first of Councilmember Lukey's bills today, is Expedited Bill 5-23, Personnel and Human Resources, Prospective Employees, Healthcare Privacy. The expedited bill would limit inquiries by the county regarding certain health information of prospective employees, prohibit inquiries by the county regarding certain reproductive health information of prospective employees, limit consideration of certain health information of prospective county employees, and generally amend laws regarding human resources and healthcare privacy. And I think, Ms. Wellens, do I want to turn it over to you to kind of walk us through the packet today?
Certainly, we're joined by Director Anderson, Office of Human Resources, as well as Ms. Bryant, the Manager of Occupational Medical Services, and I'm happy to provide an overview. I don't know if Councilmember Lukey wanted to make any preliminary comments about this one before we dive in?
No, just that the proposed amendments I've reviewed and I've discussed with everyone, and we're amenable to them. Certainly in particular, I use the term contractual positions. That's a holdover for me from the state. So understanding that that's not a language piece that is customarily used here. There were 2 proposed amendments in the packet that could address that situation and address that language choice. My personal preference is to use the second proposed amendment, which is at the top of page 4 of the packet, which says contractual positions means an individual providing services to the county pursuant to a procurement under Chapter 11B. Contractual position does not include the employees or subcontractors of a contractor under Chapter 11B. And I think I prefer that one over the other one because it does provide that specificity about other types of contractual relationships that may exist for the county for various services. But other than that, everything else is, the amendments are good to go by me.
Great. As long as we just walk through the amendments so
Right.
folks watching know what we're talking about.
Fantastic. Right. Correct. So, under the bill, as the chair explained, this bill would restrict the county's ability with respect to applicants who are applying for employment with the county, would restrict our ability to ask them about any medical healthcare related information about the applicant that is not business related. Business related is defined under the bill so that it means information about the individual's healthcare that would be pertinent to their ability to perform the published job qualifications. And so the nuance that we're talking about here, and we're under issue number 1 of the staff packet, is the applicability of the bill to contractual employees. And we use the term contractual positions under the bill, but as we discussed with OHR and the procurement folks and the county attorney's office, that might be a bit of a misnomer, since we are, instead of using contractual positions per se, what we do at the county is that we sometimes have contracts with individuals for them to provide us with services, and it's covered under the procurement law. So to clarify that, as Councilmember Lukey was explaining, one option would be, well, let's better define what we mean by contractual position, and the option before you would be to define contractual position as an individual providing services to the county pursuant to a procurement under Chapter 11B, and then to clarify that that does not include the employees of that contractor. In other words, we're not trying to extend this to, a county vendor's employees. So that was one option, and then just the other option that was noted in the packet was, well, we could just simply take out the reference to contractual employees, would be another way to clarify, but, might not provide the level of specificity that you wanted, and I am not sure if Director Anderson has an opportunity to review or has input on this one.
Tracy Anderson, Director, Office of Human Resources. First, I'd like to thank Councilmember Lukey for bringing this issue forward and for this council's partnership in addressing the issue. We don't have any particular preference about which option. We're perfectly amenable to the option the council member made.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. So just for clarity, Councilmember Lukey, can you restate which of the options you prefer?
It would be option 2, which leaves the language of contractual position in, but further defines what a contractual position is by limiting it to those small procurements for an individual who provides services, like, for example, like a contractor who works in a county council member's office, but that does not include employees or subcontractors of a vendor providing services to the county.
Great. Terrific. Any concerns about that? Nope. That amendment looks good. We can move on to the second one, timing of implementation.
Great, thank you, Chair Stewart. So the second issue, timing of implementation, and I'd like to defer to Director Anderson to kind of give you some more context about this one. But essentially, we had received a request through the county executive to provide a bit more of runway for OHR to change their policies and procedures so that they could comply with the requirements of this bill. And the suggestion from the county executive was to have the requirements take effect 120 days after passage of the legislation.
First, I'll go to Councilmember Lukey, since it's your bill. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, and we all met previously to discuss these issues, and I know that they're already working on aspects of this, so, and understanding the logistics of what needs to be done in order to operationalize it, I fully support having the act take effect 120 days after it becomes law.
Great. And I know Councilmember Friedson wants to talk to us, and Katz, and I'll just say, I think it's going to be similar. I know, Ms. Andrews, you're fairly new in this position, and I will support the amendment. I will say publicly, I am actually disappointed we even have to be here, and that Councilmember Lukey had to propose this, and that's not on you because I know you're new. And to know that these forms were already updated in June. Of 2022, and so I support this, but I did want to say publicly, when issues were raised back in December, when those of us who are new were, getting their staff fully up to speed and onboarded and everything, it's just disappointing that action wasn't taken at that time and that this legislation is even needed. But I appreciate your work on this, and I understand you're new to the director position as well as us being new, so I just thank you for your work on this. Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you, Madam Chair, for that. I echo every comment you just made. And thank you to the sponsor for putting this forward. This has been a discussion since the new council members came on board. I will admit I wasn't aware of this, and I'm embarrassed by the fact that the county has for years been asking these wildly inappropriate and unnecessary questions of people, which I am shocked about, honestly. And I share the disappointment that we shouldn't need a bill to do this. These questions aren't required and necessary. Saying that they can't be asked shouldn't be required or necessary. And so I do think, important to signal to the workforce that we are moving in this direction, and to signal to anybody who wants to serve the public in one of the best places they can serve that they are not going to be put through what too many people have been put through up to this point. But I am, I will defer, to my colleague who introduced the bill, and to you and your conversations. But for that, I would not be supportive of this, to be honest with you. I think that this should, be implemented as soon as possible, and I'm shocked that it hasn't been implemented already. I'm just curious, are you already starting this work?
We started the work, council member, at the time it was brought to our notice. Ms. Michelson reached out in December and requested a meeting for January, and then we did follow up with the meeting. We've been working with county attorney and our staff to review the forms. In the meantime, when there are areas of concern, we are having the medical staff who provide the service review with the candidate. We're not losing any candidates because of conflict on submitting the form at this time, since it was brought to our notice. So I just wanted to also clarify a couple of things. Our medical services are delivered by a third-party medical provider in a HIPAA compliant medical center. The form that we have has some unfortunate questions on there. Are you pregnant? Should have said, are you able to have an x-ray today, if that's part of your medical requirement. So there was never any specific question around, are you, have you had a miscarriage, are you using birth control, those types of things. But the string down the line, when you start to answer questions about what are your prescriptions, those sorts of things, that is where the rub is. So the staff has been working mightily to streamline the form, to ask only those questions that have to do with the essential functions of the position to be performed. We're doing it in compliance with ADA, FMLA, all of those federal guidelines, the HIPAA guidelines, and the medical records are not kept in the same location as the personnel records. They're in a locked environment at the clinic. The employee medical examiner does not share the specifics of an employee's condition with an employer. The hiring manager never will know that I have a particular condition. They know that I may need an accommodation to perform my role. So all of those things we're working to clarify. When people come in on the form, it'll say what the specific uses are. It'll ask an employee, a candidate, to say, this is the type of role I'm in. It'll prompt the doctor to look more closely at the guidelines for the job, what the essential functions are, and if there are any areas of conflict, that'll be worked out between the candidate and the medical provider. So we are working on it. We've been working on it since Ms. Michelson brought it to notice, since we met with Councilman Lutke and her team. And the county executive is very concerned about it and put me on notice that we needed to take care of it. So we're working on it.
Well, I appreciate you stepping up and taking care of it. I'm just curious, the timeline is because you have to figure out which jobs require what medical test. Because I mean, I understand certain jobs do require some level of physical exertion, and there may be a safety reason why they would need to. That's not true for most county jobs probably, but for some. And so just so I understand and so the public understands, I think it's important why we're delaying a bill like this.
So
is it that you have to go through and figure out every classification of job and then figure out what the form would be and what are appropriate questions and necessary questions and what are not?
We're trying to avoid having separate forms for separate jobs, but we're going to cut out those administrative office-related positions and not ask the questions about heavy metals and have you ever had a exposure to asbestos or something, those sorts of things, and to then align it to our online system. That's going to just take a little bit of time. It may be sooner than the 120 days, but that will give us enough room to make sure that everything is working. And as I said, we're not losing any candidates now because of the specific issues on the form. We are directing the doctors that when employees don't fill in that portion of the form, how do you really need that information, and to work that out between the candidate and the medical provider.
We hope we're not losing any candidates. We don't know if a candidate found a question to be invasive and chose to
They're very
pursue
vocal
another
right
opportunity.
now. I think they would complain to us.
We hope so. Okay. Wow. Thank you for that. I really do appreciate your work and that you have stepped in to this. You did not create this problem and you're fixing it, which I know all of us appreciate, and I want to express that as well. All of us were shocked and I think embarrassed the fact that we were asking questions that just seemed to be wildly inappropriate to ask for many of our employees. So with that, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Katz.
Thank you. I agree with my colleagues have said, and thank you for working on this. And obviously, we thank Councilmember Lutke for bringing this to us. Councilmember Friedson said that he wasn't aware of it for 4 years. I haven't been aware of it for 8. So if we would have known this would have been corrected much sooner. And obviously, you're correcting it as soon as we do, or as soon as we're aware of it. And I'm fine with the amendments. So.
Yeah, and just to clarify for the millions watching at home, as you all like to say.
This one you might have.
The reason why council members were unaware of this is because we don't fill out this form, right? So this is not a form that anyone who's previously served on the council or serving on the council now would have ever seen as a part of their onboarding, because we don't fill out this form. So just wanted to make that clarification.
Good. Great. Thank you. Ms. Wellens, I think we have one more amendment.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. The under item number 3 of the staff memorandum, the final potential issue that we raised for your consideration is a clarifying amendment through some conversations with the OHR. Staff thought it might be helpful to just make very clear under the language that with respect to the business-related information, that it's the county's prerogative as the employer to get the information, to request the information that it needs, as opposed to, a negotiation with third parties, for example. So the potential clarification, you have the text there, will be amending lines 34 through 39 to say that unless otherwise prohibited by law, the county is entitled to, as opposed to the county may, request or seek business-related health care information. Again, the business-related is tightly defined, and consider business-related health care information solely to determine whether an applicant meets a minimum qualification.
Great, thank you. And Councilmember Lukey, you're good with this one?
Yes, because again, if it is related to a minimum qualification, they have the right to examine that. And then, of course, if there's a dispute about whether it's related to a minimum qualification or not, there's a grievance provision written into the statute.
Great, all right. Everyone's good with that? I think unless someone wants to raise anything else, the amendments look good, and we're all, the committee, the Government Operations Fiscal Policy Committee is good to recommend this for our full council. And again, we thank Director Anderson, your staff, and everyone for already beginning this work on this, and thank our colleague, Councilmember Lukey, for bringing this forward, and we look forward to voting on it with the full council. So thank you very much for coming today. All right, our next item number 3, is Bill 8-23, Boards, Committees, and Commissions. Open meetings, supplemental requirements, which would require boards, committees, and commissions to publish within certain timeframes the dates, times, and locations of meetings, meeting agenda, and meeting minutes, among other measures. This bill would generally amend the laws regarding boards, committees, and commissions, and regarding open meetings. Again, Councilmember Lukey, this is your bill. If you have any opening comments, and then I'll turn it over to Ms. Wellens.
Sure. So we've had some discussions with the County Executive's Office and Councilmember Katz to do some clarifications or amendments just to make sure things are going to the correct office, and also to clarify that with respect to that we're going to remove the provision related to draft minutes, so that it only applies where you would post if you have in fact recorded your meeting. So under state law, there was a change, I don't know, maybe 6 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that, so that entities that recorded their meetings, public bodies that recorded a meeting, could just post the recording instead of having to draft minutes. Especially once the pandemic started and more people started having hybrid meetings or on Zoom, the recording function tended to take flight, and people realized it was a lot easier to have the recording made and then just post the link on their website. So that is an option, and should any of our boards, committees, and commissions choose to do that, they can just put the link up, but we will not require draft minutes to be posted within 5 business days as originally drafted.
Great. Anything else? All right, Ms. Wellens.
Thank you, Chair Stewart. So just to provide, a little bit of context for the millions at home, as you know, there's the Open Meetings Act for the state of Maryland that applies to the county council, applies to all of our local public bodies, as well as the state bodies throughout Maryland, and it has certain requirements with respect to conducting meetings of public bodies in public in a manner accessible to the public, with advance notice and notice to the public of how they can access the meeting, which is of course especially important in our era of virtual or hybrid meetings, requires minutes to be taken and to contain certain information, and for those minutes to be available to the public. And we in the county have 80 or so boards, committees, and commissions. We also have some procedural requirements for those, we call them BCCs, and those procedural requirements are laid out in Chapter 2 of the County Code. They're kind of requirements in addition to the Open Meetings Act, and so this bill would provide some supplemental requirements that kind of add on to the Open Meetings Act requirements in an effort to kind of coordinate how the broad number of BCCs, kind of how they're following the state requirements. There are some other, in Baltimore City, for example, and you can see in the packet, there's some examples. There's an example of another jurisdiction in Maryland that has done this by requiring that their minutes, that their notices be published a certain amount of time in advance, and that they go to a central office within the city, and that minutes be published within a certain time period. That's just even slightly more aggressive, I guess, than the Open Meetings Act requirements. So this bill is similar, and requiring that the agendas and notice be be posted in advance within 5 business days after the meeting after it's been decided there's going to be a meeting, and after the agenda is completed, then everything needs to be published within 5 business days after that, or at least 2 calendar days before the meeting takes place. And then there's an exception for emergency situations in which that information could be published 24 hours in advance. So, you know, as noted, and I'm sure as the committee appreciates, you know, coordinating these BCCs is a gargantuan task. We have, in terms of potential amendments for your consideration, they start at the bottom of page 4, and it's under item number 3. The first potential amendment for your consideration was, you know, which executive department or office should receive complaints. Part of the bill is that individuals or even members of the BCC, if they have concerns that the provisions.
Ms. Mullins, before we get into the amendments, I want to, Mr. Hartman's here,
sorry.
and I want to be able to. No, it's okay. I appreciate the background, but he's been sitting through our committee, and I want to give him the opportunity to also comment on the bill. So I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chair Stewart and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Ken Hartman-Espada. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships in the Office of the County Executive. And 2 weeks ago, I assumed management of the county's boards, commissions, and committees.
Lucky duck.
And this has already fallen apart?
Everyone.
God.
Yeah, but so as part of those new duties of beginning to examine the workflow for appointments, responsibilities of our departments, responsibilities and workload on our one full-time admin in the county exec's office who works on all of this. We are very much we're concerned and have been following up with our departments and our BCC liaisons on open meetings. We've issued guidance to them on coming current with minutes and agendas and notices. There was the pandemic. I don't want to. We're going to be hearing this for the next several years, a pandemic. But in this case, as we moved to all virtual meetings, and some boards went on hiatuses before anyone knew how to operate Zoom meetings, there was an element of sloppiness that came into our work. And so, in the county exec's office, we are also working on a system of transparency and compliance, evaluating a meeting tomorrow with TEBS on a single place. Right now, we have a single calendar for all BCCs to put notice of their meetings, and we'd like to explore a single place where all minutes and agendas are kept and posted in a timely fashion. There are other issues that another meeting we'll talk about, such as guidance on term extensions and what that process should be, and also geographic and racial diversity, and the barriers to service that many of our residents might experience if they want to serve in one of our BCCs. And we need to begin work on the committee for evaluation and review of a board. So this is what we used to call in the old days the committee on committees, that every so often is supposed to meet and give the council and the executive recommendations on how committees are functioning and how we can improve or sunset some boards. With that said, you know, we had a very productive meeting with Councilmember Lukey. I do want to raise the issue with recording meetings, and we'll set up a follow-up meeting before this bill comes to council on recording. County attorney has raised some issues regarding privacy, but I know you have experience in this, and so we'll connect them with your expertise on that topic. But happy to work with the council and committee on this matter.
Great, thank you, and thank you for joining us today. All right, Ms. Mullins, do you want to continue going through the amendments proposed?
Certainly, great. And just a note that the bill does not require recordings. It requires their posting when the recordings are done, just a clarification. So back to item number 3. As mentioned, the bill allows members of the BCC or members of the public to reach out to, as originally drafted, the Office of Community Partnerships to lodge a complaint if they feel that the requirements of the bill are not being met, and then that office would kind of perform a liaison function to try to get the issues resolved, and also would be issuing quarterly reports to the council about the nature of the complaints received and how they were resolved. And I would hope to defer to my colleague, Mr. Hartman, to discuss what might be the appropriate office or agency to receive those complaints. There's also an amendment for your consideration that would provide additional flexibility to the county executive to be the one to say, okay, let me identify which office or department should be performing this function of receiving the complaints.
And just to clarify, so the reason there's a provision like this in here to begin with is that, you know, of course, the public always has a right to complain to the Open Meetings Compliance Board at the state level. But the issue is these boards, committees, and commissions are staffed with people who are members of the public, who are volunteering, and sometimes they are the ones who can't get the things posted or can't get the executive branch office responsible to post the things. So it would be awkward for them to have to go to complain to the state about their own body. So this allows them to have an outlet for that at whatever office the county executive determines should be the appropriate recipient.
Great.
And the county exec's office already manages if you see the notice, it's from the office of county executive. If you apply, it comes in through the county executive. If you're appointed, it comes in from the county executive. So it makes sense that we will be, the office of county executive is the point of contact for complaints.
Great. All right, all okay with that amendment? All right, terrific. Let's move on then.
Thank you. The next potential amendment for your consideration, and we're under item number 4 of the staff memorandum, would be to add some provisions related to when the rare circumstance when there's an actual declared emergency by the government, i.e. COVID pandemic. Right. So in the rare event that we already have the provision for if there's an emergency, you still need to publish 24 hours in advance. Well, if there's a declared emergency and you really have to meet, thinking along the lines of, as an example, like Board of Health type situations, that you would do the posting as soon as practicable as opposed to within, the 24 hours in advance. So it provides a little bit more of an out for those emergencies.
Any comments? All right, looks good.
The last item for your consideration relates to, I would term them as clarifying or technical amendments, some amendments that Councilmember Lutke's office identified, some clarifications that needed to be made, lines 34 through 35. The term business to describe the 5 business days was inadvertently left out with the council staff's original drafting, so that's put that in there. Then lines 53 through 55. Well, this would now be not the Office of Community Partnerships, but the designated office would be able to consult with the group and address compliance issues under the section, just to try to make clear that these are complaints related to compliance with these supplemental requirements, not the OMA itself. The county executive isn't going to be fielding the OMA complaints. And along those same lines, to add that after line 58, a clarification that nothing in this section prevents an individual from submitting a complaint to the State Open Meetings Compliance Board under the State Open Meetings Act, and then provides the citation for the Open Meetings Act.
Great. Yeah. So I think we're all good with this, but then I'm turning it over to Councilmember Katz, I think, for the next one, right?
Well, or in general, and I'm certainly good with all of this, but the question becomes, if someone complains, what do you, and it doesn't get corrected, what's the next step? How are you working on that? I know you have nothing else to do, and this would be something, but candidly, and I'm not being flippant here.
Well, speaking on my own behalf, a complaint on Open Meetings Act would come into the county exec's office. We would follow up immediately with the department that staffs that BCC, and it would be a performance expectation of our departments to rapidly come into compliance. Of course, There are hypotheticals what happens,
Sure.
but I can only give you my assurance, and there is, of course, the outlet, as we heard last year from the State Compliance Board, that remains the backstop, I suppose.
Okay. And I believe we need to be doing this, et cetera, but that's always the concern, is someone complains, and I guess we get back with the person who complained, right? Okay, thanks.
And then, of course, too, with the transparency piece, where there will be quarterly reports to the council of how much this is happening, that keeps us informed so that we can have an appropriate compliance function.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So those were all the amendments in the packet.
Yes,
have
and
one
then
other
there's
amendment.
Councilmember Katz's amendment to remove the requirement of posting draft minutes, and I'm fine with that.
Okay, everyone okay with that? All right, we're good with that. Any other comments or anything? I think Councilmember Friedson had.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you to Councilmember Lukey for putting this forward to add some transparency and consistency to the boards, committees, and commissions. I really do appreciate it. It's an issue that's been raised that I think this will help to resolve. Thank you to Mr. Hartman Espada for stepping in your 2-week term here. The large category, I call the COVID years, 2021 was the longest decade until 2022, which was the longest decade since 2020. So it probably feels like 2 years for you, but appreciate the other duties as a sign ledger is quite large and getting bigger by the day. So I appreciate it. I just want to know a couple things. I have been on boards, committees, and commissions, have been through the process of recruitment. These are not all created equally. We know that. And some are very sophisticated and have lots of staff support and work very closely with the county. And some are more organic and very much volunteer run and are going to need a lot of support in order to do this. And I just wanted to make sure that we made that clear. The public has the right, to know what is going on, but these boards and committees and commissions that are overwhelmingly volunteers who are stepping up to serve in our community should get the support that they need from the county, and if we can't handle it, either we shouldn't do them or we should provide the adequate level of support that they need. So I appreciate the fact that you're stepping into this role, that you have a broad understanding of the expanses of county government. We'll be able to make some recommendations for how to handle some of these issues, but I do think there are going to be some of these groups that are going to struggle with compliance and are going to need support from the county in some form or fashion, and we need to be able to step up to provide that. So I just wanted to note that here, and I'm seeing a nod, and so I know there's a commitment from you and from the executive branch to do that, but I just wanted to note that.
Thank you so much, Councilmember. That is also why we periodically engage the SERB, which is, and they meet with every board and commission, with every staff person. It's an exhaustive process because we have 90 of these, and they ask those questions about, and they make those recommendations. I do want to look back at the 2013, 2014 report, because there were recommendations on staffing, and I do want to, on some boards, and looking forward in the last 10 years, it'd be useful to figure out, well, did we ever provide that support, or is it continuing to be this volunteer ad hoc, seat of your pants type of operation in some of these committees?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And as you're doing it, even though it's not relevant to this particular bill, I just wanted to flag, Councilmember Balcom has talked frequently about the geographic representation of these boards, committees, and commissions. I'm sure Councilmember Lukey, who has fervently nodded as Councilmember Balcom has raised that, and so I thought it would be important to note that here. I hope that you will be looking into that as you do your review, and also Council President Glass and I and several others have frequently raised concerns about the extensions, not because we don't appreciate those who have provided great service to the county, but that we have a 1.1 million person county of incredibly talented and diverse people, and we want to make sure that we're providing opportunities to as many people as possible. And so really understanding the number of extensions that are being requested, why they're being requested, what type of recruitment we are doing for these boards, committees, and commissions, and whether or not they represent the demographic and geographic and diversity of viewpoints that we would expect from committees and commissions and boards that are supposed to be, and I think oftentimes serve as representative bodies for the public and for our county.
Now, just going to remind my colleague that this committee did request an OLO report covering those topics, so I hope it will be helpful as we move forward on this. Councilmember Lukey.
And I did just want to add, and I know Mr. Hartman, Asada, and I already spoke about this, that every member of the board, the public bodies, they have to take the Open Meetings Act compliance course, which is free, tedious but free, and that certainly in terms of assisting with any housekeeping or thoughts you want to bounce off me, he knows that I'm available and my door is always open for that. So I certainly appreciate the cooperation of the County Executive's Office in moving this forward.
Great. All right. With that, I think our recommendation from the committee is to move it forward to the full council for a vote. And again, I just want to thank Ms. Wellens for her excellent work as always, and thank you to the County Exec's Office for its continued collaboration on this. And congratulations to Councilmember Lukey on her 2 bills getting through committee. Yay! All right. Thank you, everyone. We are adjourned. We're done.